start thinking about how much time we have with students, if they take an hour lesson once a week, maybe they have a lesson 40 weeks. But when you think about 40 weeks, that's one work week. You have one work week to teach them everything they need to know.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath. So glad to have you here today. Visit our site at contrabassconversations.com for all the details about what's going on here. And I love hearing from people. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out and email me at feedback@contrabassconversations.com. Send me a message on Twitter, Facebook. I'd love to hear your story. And this week, we're going deep into the topic of teaching. We're talking private lesson teaching, we're talking public school teaching, we're talking university level teaching, and we're talking teaching with a long-term focus and teaching the complete musician way beyond just the notes on the page. And you can learn more about teaching, which is a topic I'm totally passionate about and have covered extensively here on the podcast. You can visit contrabassconversations.com/teaching. This is a new resource that I'm putting out this week. Totally excited about it. So give it a visit, share it with students, share it with colleagues. It's a compilation of what I've learned through these hundreds of interviews about resources, repertoire sequences, recordings you should start with, everything for beginners, intermediate players, and advanced players. And I know you're going to love today's conversation with Cornelia Watkins. Cornelia Watkins, Corky Watkins, teaches at Rice University and is the author of Rosin Dust and the co-author of From the Stage to the Studio, How Fine Musicians Become Great Teachers. She served as the national chairperson of the American String Teachers Association, ASTA, their Committee on Studio Instruction. And she served for 6 years as the private teacher representative on the board of TexASTA. And Corky and I dig into Comprehensive Musicianship through Performance, or CMP for short. And now, anyone involved in teaching is bombarded with acronyms all the time, but I like this one. In fact, the CMP people jokingly call it one acronym to rule them all. And just think about those words for a minute. Comprehensive Musicianship through Performance. What I like about CMP and about this approach to teaching is it taps into the why of teaching music. Why are we doing this in the first place? And for most of the students I've taught, the why is not to get into a professional orchestra. Most of the young people I work with are destined to do other things. So how do we turn these people that we work with into lifelong learners and lovers of music? And that's what CMP delves into. And that's why I want to let you know about it on this podcast. Be sure to check out links in the show notes to learn more about the CMP model of teaching. I'm not going to go in depth here, but please check that out. And Corky and I talk about this, but you can get more details through the link. And listen to how Corky describes what she learned about the Carnival of the Animals and how that affected the way she taught that piece in the Swan. And what if we did that for all the pieces we taught? What if we approached our teaching in more of a three-dimensional way, or as you'll see with CMP, it's actually a five-dimensional way, a five-dimensional approach to teaching. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, D'Addario Strings, and let you know a little bit about their Zyx strings, which I'm actually using on my bass right now. They got great sustain, great attack. They're excellent for pizzicato playing. They're great under the bow. I play a lot of arco. I play a lot of pizzicato, and I love the sound. Rich, full sound, kind of a gut-like tone. They come in medium gauge. They come in light gauge. They're made in the USA, designed, engineered, and crafted at the D'Addario String Factory in New York. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, folks. And without further ado, here is our interview with Corky Watkins. Maybe we can start just like a little, because I'm sure probably 0 to 2% of my audience has any idea what CMP even is. You know, and then maybe we could just like talk about that a little bit, and maybe how you use it, or how you think folks could use it in private lessons, and why it's beneficial. And like, I understand that, but I'd love to, you know, I think it'll be a lot of fun to just kind of dig into that.
Did you go to a workshop?
Yeah. Well, I went to the Illinois, the 2014 workshop. And then I've never been up to Wisconsin, but did you make it up there?
Yes, I started, if you want, when I went to the Texas Orchestra Directors Conference, it was a summer back in 2003 or something like that, 2002, early 2000s. And there was nothing for me to do there except go to this board meeting for the Texas chapter of ASTA.
Right.
And they'd asked me to be on it, so I joined. Anyway, so that's why I was there. Everybody else was a school teacher, so they were all going to all these sessions about conducting and all this kind of stuff, and I didn't find any of it interesting, so I figured I wasn't going to go to any sessions at all. But then I found Randy Swigham's thing, and I didn't know Randy. I didn't know who he was. All I saw was this little emblem that looked like maybe they were trying to sell something.
Right.
and it had all this glowing stuff about, personal connection to the music and all this kind of stuff. It's like, oh yeah, right. And prove it to me. So I went, and I was just totally blown away by what he was doing. He was, he was actually in a lot of ways doing what I already love doing in my own lessons, which is drawing on a whole bunch of different aspects of music, not just teaching them the fingrangs and showing them how to count it or whatever, but actually, talking about the composer, drawing them into the process. Why do you think he chose this dynamic here when he used forte back here? Why is this one piano, or why is this in a minor key? All this kind of stuff. I love doing all that with my students, and figured I was just privy to it because I was a private teacher and I got to do that kind of stuff, right? So he was showing us how, he was taking apart the Peer Gynt suite, the Anis's Toad, the dirge, basically. And he was showing us how he brought his orchestra class into it by, getting them to say, if you had just 4 notes to use, how would you make a whole piece out of 4 notes? And drawing, how creative could you be about those 4? And just going, just developing it so beautifully. It was just a wonderful, it was sort of mind blowing, frankly.
Yeah.
In fact, I was sitting next to a friend of mine who was a orchestra director, and who I know she spoon fed the kids every single note, and the kids never thought once. They just did what they were told, right? And she had, award winning orchestras all her life, but she turned to me and she goes, God, I guess I missed the boat. She had just retired. And I thought, really, that's that. But that is, I thought, well, that's kind of a shame, because really there's so much more for students to learn than just the notes of the piece, So, anyway, I started sending, Rosendust at that time was in newsletter form. So I started sending, Randy Rosendust, and then he invited me to come up to the next summer's workshop, which at the time was only 3 days. But I thought, it seems like it's worth it for whatever reason. It was worth going to the expense to get up there. So I was, and that ever since then, I thought, well, why is this not provided for private teachers? And so another couple of years later, after that, they added a private teaching component to the CMP workshop. So.
Oh, interesting. That's cool. And it's great that Randy was the window into that world. And I actually know Randy really well. I used to play in the Elgin Symphony, and he was the youth, the conducted all the youth concerts, and he conducts the Elgin Youth Symphony and I've gone and coached their bass sectionals and only later in life discovered that he's like this CMP, this huge figure in the world of education.
Right. Yeah, he's amazing. And lucky you, because I always think the kids that get to be in his youth orchestra and get coached by him, I don't know what your experience was, but I always imagine that you come out with a much richer experience than any youth orchestra, at least that I've encountered.
Right. Yeah. What's cool about Randy is he's actually teaching a CMP lesson through the structure of a youth orchestra and that traditional kind of rehearsal structure, which is fascinating. But could we maybe? I'd love it if you could kind of summarize, because people listening, they probably are like, "What is CMP? What is it exactly?" Could you maybe just briefly describe what it is?
Absolutely. So CMP stands for Comprehensive Musicianship through Performance. Very lumpy thing. CMP is a lot easier to say. So that's why I just always refer to as CMP. But basically, it's a way for teachers to intentionally build in more than just note reading and learning and putting on concerts. So that their students are actually not only developing their skills at their instrument, but they are learning concepts about, knowledge, based concepts about terminology, form, music theory, whatever's kind of essential ingredients that we all as musicians need to know. But, a lot of times it gets kicked down the road to, college, or even, unfortunately, later than college. So it introduces concepts that students can actually use not just in the piece that they're learning, but in basically anything that they do with music. If they learn about form, they're not just going to learn about one particular form. They're going to talk about structures in music and relate it to architecture or things in their daily lives. ABA form is a peanut butter sandwich or whatever. Whatever. Yeah, right. But we once you tie in those knowledge items, it starts to make sense, because it's not just some abstract concept, but it actually is something that makes sense to us in our regular lives rather than just an abstract concept in music. And then beyond that is a personal experience or a communal experience of making music and going into more depth in that connection. It's those intangibles that are kind of hard to reach and hard to teach. And you can't make anybody feel something, of course, but that devising ways that students can start getting in touch with how they feel about a piece, or creating a community project around a performance piece, and or having basically a community experience within the orchestra. So it's all of those things put together, but making sure that it's built into a teaching plan so that it becomes more intentional. It's not just something that you just, as soon as you're in front of your orchestra or in front of your student, you just immediately gravitate toward your default setting of, we better put some fingerings in, or, how come you can't play that in tune? That we're looking beyond that and intentionally going beyond that.
Yeah. It's a model that just resonates so strongly with me, because it kind of gets to the point of, like, why are we teaching people music? What is the goal? And as someone who taught high school orchestra for a long time, I think, like, what am I doing here? Am I teaching people how to play Tchaikovsky 5 really well, and then they leave and they say, we played Tchaikovsky 5? Or am I trying to instill a love of music, and how am I doing that? And I mean, that's what really connects with me in terms of the model.
Right. And that's what I really loved about when I went up to the workshop, the passion of, frankly, the teachers, the committee members who are teaching it. They don't get paid to do that. They get their expenses paid for, but basically they're doing it because they're passionate about it themselves, and they really want to share it. They know how meaningful it's been to them and their students. And so they're just there not to make money in the summer, but to actually really draw people into the process and make their discoveries for themselves. I mean, the whole idea, we're talking about the model, but we haven't really explained it. It's a 5-point model where it's the first. Well, you can start pretty much anywhere along the model, but it's a selection of music, making sure that you're selecting really good music, and that's usually not a problem for private teachers, frankly, when it comes right down to it. It's analyzing the music. That's a problem. Everybody goes, no, not analysis. But really digging deeply into the music and discovering things that you never saw before about that music. Something that you love, but something maybe even though you thought you knew. I'll go into that a little bit more later. But and then selecting from there what are the most essential things that a student can get. And CMP goes towards 3 objectives or 3 outcomes. I don't know, they were always changing that word, but the idea is it's something that we really want the students, 3 things that we really want the students to learn. It's a skill-based concept, a knowledge-based one, and they call it the affective, which is more of an experiential thing. And then choosing, and then once you've got those chosen, then you start coming up with strategies for creating the learning, making sure that the learning happens, environments, and whatever the practical things you want the students to be able to do. And then assessment, which is a lot of times like the strategies where if you ask a student if it's a knowledge-based thing, you ask them to, write the harmonies underneath a Bach suite or something, that you're that you'll know what they understand and what they don't. By the time they get finished doing that, you'll get what they get and you'll understand what they don't get, and you'll know where the gaps are and continue to fill those. And that's a kind of a circular process that you can probably just, kind of go pretty much in any direction. You can even choose something your students need to learn and then pick a piece from there to, and we teachers do that all the time, right? I mean, especially private teachers, because we can kind of handpick pieces, and that's a student who's never done an off the string stroke, so you find a piece that's going to teach them that. But then from there, is that all you're going to teach in that piece? Is the piece truly good enough to actually teach them more than that, go beyond that? So you can, like I say, you can kind of enter that model at pretty much any point, and then flesh it out, and it's invariably because nobody's telling you what you should be doing. You are free to pick anything you want, anything your student needs, anything that is important for them to understand about the music, and apply that.
Well, I love the experience of the workshop. One thing that just really struck me is we're in a group and we have elementary school general music teachers, and we have someone like in your position teaching at the college level and every other iteration of music teacher, and they're all coming together and they're able to use this model even in an elementary general classroom or a full orchestra or a choir, and it's just a flex. And what I love about it is how it's kind of a checks and balances for making sure that you're really giving someone that complete musical experience. Like you were saying, like the technical ability, like actually being able to execute something, the skill, the knowledge, knowing behind it. And then that sort of hard to articulate emotional component, the affective component. It's so easy, just to teach the notes or to kind of randomly spew out some bit of knowledge and it makes it really intentional, I think.
Right. It absolutely. So I know one of the things you wanted to talk about is how it actually really truly applies to private teachers, and I touched on that a little bit, but one of the ways it really has affected my teaching and the way I think that students benefit the most from the modifications that I've made in my teaching is instead of telling, like what you just said, instead of just telling the student what they need to know, you get them to find it. You have ways of, like, if I'm teaching students about harmonics on their cello, there's a different ways you can approach it. You can get them to just run their hands up and down the strings without pressing down and finding the harmonics and seeing if they can identify what notes they've found. And then going from there and exploring how to use those for, dividing up the strings in different ways. And then how do you use those for tuning and, so that there's an extension to that. So that it's not just you say, okay, put your finger here and hear that note, that's this note, and then use that for testing this note. I mean, you can do that, and that's one way of doing it, but the exploration really draws the student into the process. And, or just, frankly, something as simple as defining terminology that we see all over the music that sometimes, frankly, just gets neglected. We get so busy teaching fingerings and intonation or whatever that, oh yeah, it says, whatever, morendo there. What is that? You don't just say, oh, well, slow down, get softer. That's all you have to do. I mean, what does morendo actually mean? And so I frequently send my students home when we've been looking at that. I'll send them, make a list of all the terms in your piece. And I always say, this is the composer talking to you.
Nice. Yeah.
It's true, it's like, she wrote it there because we were trying to get something across, and that word meant something to that composer. And so, why is it that word instead of just retard or diminuendo? Why morendo? Why any of those? So to be able to look up the term and know what it means, and then consider why. And that's of course that whole analysis thing of CMP is. Why that? Why did the composer make the theme major here and then turn it minor here? You have to speculate. You have to spend lots of time speculating because most of the time, some of the music has been modern and you can call the composer and ask them why.
Right. Yeah.
But 99% of the time, the music that we play, that's not possible. And so to be able to say, okay, there's got to be a reason here. What do I think the reason is? And to, after you've dug around a piece for a while, you start coming up with things that you think maybe that's the case. If you do a little research on the composer and start realizing, well, that person's personality was a certain way. I mean, of course, there's some obvious examples like Schumann and things like that, where the reason there's so many character changes in his music has something to do with all the character changes going on in his brain, I mean, those are the more obvious ones. I mean, there's certainly lots and lots of ways you can dig around a composer's life and a composer's works and their situations and start realizing that there's a lot more to the music they were in that was inspired by something, and there's something inside them that they're expressing either about their own life or their personality or their whatever, and those things, events in their lives. There's reasons why, and the more you get students to start doing some of that work, they start connecting to what it is about, this music. This is not just black spots on a white page, but a human being behind this.
Well, I something that I love as a teacher is approaching teaching from this model is it forces me to really dive deep into whatever piece I'm teaching and really analyze it myself before I can, do anything. And so even though it can be a hard process in trying to find the heart statement for a piece, in the end, I end up knowing a piece really well. I'd love to know, how do you approach a teaching plan for specific pieces? Could you maybe give an example of a piece that you've done a plan for and what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. You're absolutely right. The whole process of digging into a piece is actually, this is one of the, you actually asked what is a weakness that I am aware of in my, the students at Rice or the colleagues and stuff. And a big part of the problem, especially for private teachers, is that the pieces that we teach are usually the ones that we learned a lot of times a long time ago. And we know them because we've known them all our lives. And, we played them for our students, and we played them on recitals and whatever. And so we feel, because we played them over and over again and they've been part of our lives for 20, 30, whatever, how many years, that we know the piece. Like, we really know it. I really know the Swan. I really know the Swan, right? Except I started doing a lesson plan on it. I didn't really know the Swan much at all. I mean, I had ideas about it, and I had ways that I approached teaching it, but I didn't know half of what, well, frankly, was in all of the Carnival of the Animals. But just to isolate the Swan, the way he wrote that piece is actually kind of magic. And I hate to give away my magic right away, but since we have limited amount of time, there's always that question, why? Once you've done your analysis and you say, okay, well, the harmonies are this, and the bass line is shaped like this, and the melody does this, and it starts high and goes down low and goes back up again. Right. Well, if you start asking, well, why those notes? Why does the accompaniment go da-da, ya-da, da-da, dee-da, da-da, dee-da? Well, if you start drawing a line to connect those notes, you start seeing little waves. I mean, of course, we always think, oh, yeah, well, that must be the water, right? Always sounds like little rippling water, right? But he accidentally wrote in little waves, and went like, when I made that discovery, I was just sitting in a parking lot, had a little time for a gig, and I thought, oh, God. And I thought, well, what about the melody? I mean, I always talked about the first shift as being like, I always said, imagine this is your swan's neck, like the neck of your cello is the swan's neck, and this is the silky feathers, and you don't want to strangle the swan on your way down, right? Make it gentle, make it stroke the silky feathers on the swan's neck. Well, so then I look at it, and if you, just picture it, G, F sharp, there's your shift down, and then it goes back up, and then it comes back down again, and then goes up like a little tail feathers. It's the shape of a swan, for crying out loud.
Wow, yeah, that's true.
Right?
Yeah, it is.
And I even made a little mini, which doesn't look very good, but a little video like depicting this, because it's like, well, the guy was brilliant. I mean, he did it for fun. This is a piece that he wrote, like the whole Carnival of the Animals he wrote for friends when he was having a party, a week-long party at some, villa he had. And, this, of course, they didn't have, electronic games to play. They didn't sit around playing the Wii and stuff. So he came up with this piece for his friends that were going to show up. And he wrote it for the instruments of the friends that were going to show up. And then he wrote in all these little musical jokes and little things for his friends to find in there. And it's just full of those. But the Swan is just a perfect example of, here's this marvelous, I mean, it's a beautiful piece. It's one of the ones that really has lasted and everybody plays it. But it's kind of a little magical piece. It really is. And of course, that doesn't even go into the harmonies that he uses and, the way he structures the piece and everything. But just even that discovery of, oh my gosh, I'd never seen that before. And I went around and showed it to a lot of people, because I had, surely I'm not the only one that's seen this. And like nobody says, and there was somebody said, oh, you really think he did that on purpose? Are you kidding? Here's this guy that's so clever who writes all this other amazing stuff. Why wouldn't he have done that and turn it into some genius little piece? So every time I've done a lesson plan, I've done that analysis thing and dug deeply. I mean, I can list piece after piece after piece after piece that totally blew me away, even when I thought I knew what the piece was about. And the piece, it was actually my first experience was with the Elgar Cello Concerto, because I had a student who had to learn the last movement. And I'd had issues with the last movement. I was never crazy about it. I always loved the other movements, but the last movement always drove me crazy. And I had gotten tendinitis in the middle of trying to learn the last movement and had to give up on it at the time, and was studying with a teacher I didn't like very much. So I had lots of issues all around. But he was auditioning at Juilliard. He needed that last movement. So I decided that first summer, when I discovered they actually really were going to make me write a lesson plan. I mean, we private teachers, we think performance, so we don't have to do that.
Right, exactly.
That's way above that. So when they were really intended for me to write a lesson plan, that's what I picked. And I really, first of all, I had never seen all the quotes of all the previous movements that are embedded in that last movement. It was really brilliantly done. And then especially the final kind of meandering it, I think it was the last page, but he was actually, I read about his, I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but I'd read his life story, and he had this tragedy. We lost one of his siblings early on, and his parents were so devastated they really couldn't do anything. He'd actually written some music in a play for his siblings to put on about how the children have to carry forward when the parents can't continue. And, here's this little kid, 12, 13-year-old kid, writing this very profound stuff. And then you think about the arc of Elgar's life and how he'd been very famous and people loved him, but here he was really on decline when he wrote the Cello Concerto. He's got that profound statement at the beginning, and then this whole meandering last movement of like, where am I? And making jokes of himself, like making fun of himself, his little, like Jacqueline Dupre says, banana peel moments and things, and these little meandering things where you end up in one key and then another key and another key. And finally, then you're kind of lost in this kind of wilderness right towards the end. And then here's this profound thing coming back at the end, like his life full circle, and when I saw that full circle, here he was at the end of his life, kind of losing his way and thinking about where he'd started as a child and having to, be the one to step up at the time. And I just thought, I cried, when I realized that, it was really a very moving moment for me when I realized that, when you're dealing with a really great piece, you're going to find things like that and special things about that special person who wrote this amazing music. And frankly, when it comes right down to it, you're not going to find that in some of this stuff that the kids play. That's, it's just superficial. I hate to say it, there's some orchestra music out there that just turns my stomach. It's just so canned, and there's so much good music that could be played, but this stuff is, this is a 5, your students who can play, level 4 or whatever, grade 4, they'll love this piece because it's so catchy, and so it's like, oh my gosh, I worry about that. And there's frankly pieces like Romberg sonatas and things that are so formulaic that I just cannot teach them anymore. Why is this in E minor? Well, because his last piece was in major, or whatever. Right. It's like, there's no basis. Here's the slow movement. Here's the triplet part. Here's a counter, another, second melody, that's just as canned, maybe upside down from the first one. And then And then there's the 16th note passage, and it's like, I couldn't do it anymore.
Well, it's kind of like a prescription against teaching dubious music, because if you have to go through the whole process of trying to analyze, you aren't going to want to do that on something that's not worthy. And that's a great point you bring up, because there is so much garbage out there, and there's so much great music out there, and it can be so easy, maybe a little less so for the private teacher, but certainly for the orchestra director and in the public school setting, to just default, or the band director or the choir director.
Half the least resistance, and it seems a shame. And sometimes, frankly, I worry about, the part that I worry about in the, our performance world versus our music ed world is there's not enough overlap. The music ed students, I think they get the shaft when it comes to getting the best teachers. They get relegated if there's music ed. Of course, there's not music ed at Rice, but music ed like a UT or something where my colleague Lori Scott teaches. And, the performance, the elite performance teachers sometimes won't even take the music ed students. So they're not given the opportunity to actually get that kind of really premier guidance. And so what do we expect? They go into the thing, they think they can't handle it because that's the way they've been treated all through college. You're not elite, so therefore you get this aspect, you get this side of things. And then they go in there and they think, well, I'm not elite. I can't, who might have analyzed a Beethoven symphony, or teach my kids this Mozart concerto or whatever. They won't do it because they're scared of it. We run into that all the time at the CMP workshops, where there's this fear factor involved in really digging into deeply the music, because they just don't think they're capable of doing it very well. I was never very good at analysis, or whatever, and they're afraid to get into it, which is such a shame.
Yeah, no kidding. And it's such a great way to just continual education, self-educate. If you can just get over that and do it, it's like a master's degree every couple of years, working on these pieces.
Well, and here's another thing that I kind of harp on with my grad students, and that is, if you're really thinking seriously about teaching and doing a good job of it, there's any number of things. I think that was actually one of the questions you were talking about. What do you do? What does a performer need to do to get ready to teach? And probably the most important thing is to see the big picture. If you just do it one lesson at a time, you might teach some good lessons. I did it for years. I shouldn't talk like I've never been in that boat, because that's what a lot of us do. We get out of college and we need to get a little money and we teach private lessons, right? And it's kind of week to week, and oh yeah, here's this kid. Oh yeah, what was he working on? But if you really want to be serious about teaching, you see the bigger picture. If you've got a kid who's serious about bass playing, let's say, and he comes to you, sixth grader or something like that, you really want to be able to step back and see some kind of trajectory over the next 6 years, maybe. Where are they going to be in 6 years? And if they say when they're a junior in high school that they're thinking about going to music school, are they going to be ready? Are you going to have taught them, if they stick with you, are you going to have taught them what they need to know, so that it's not just like this huge, oh my God, are you kidding me? Oh no, what are we going to do now? They want to major in music and they still can't play a G major scale in tune. It's like, okay, so what do they need to get to that point where if they really want to go to a good music school, they would be ready? And if they don't, then they can go on and major whatever they want and hopefully come back to, play in a community orchestra or something. You want them to have such a good experience with it, and they've learned so much that basically they can go in any direction they choose. They are set up for that. I know I'm sort of reactive about that, because I was so badly set up when I went to college. It's a miracle that I even got into music school, but I knew it's what I wanted. And then I finally ended up with a teacher who really could give me what I needed, although it was like starting over again. But I was determined to make sure that my students, number one, were set up well technically, that they weren't going to end up with tendonitis like I did. And number two, that they'd be given all of what they needed, so that if they really said, yes, this is what I've been put on planet Earth to do, I can say, okay, well then we can get you ready. We've got one more year and we'll start picking pieces for your audition and we can do this. So if you can see the trajectory, the bigger picture, then you need to be able to say, okay, all right, as a beginner, these are the things they need, and these are the pieces they probably need to be able to play, so that by the time they are in, 8th grade, they can be starting to work on these pieces and have good thumb position or whatever. And then by the time they're, they're in high school, they're playing these pieces, more advanced repertoire and starting to learn concertos and things like that. However you see the trajectory being, and of course it's different for every student, so it's not like it's a formula, but it's a way of at least seeing that big picture and being able to say, okay, so this year, therefore, we need to get through this much repertoire, and by the time they're finished with it, they need to know these scales and arpeggios or whatever, these eights. Because when it comes right down to it, if you start thinking about how much time we have with students, if they take an hour lesson once a week for a better part of the year, and of course everybody goes away in the summer, or, you miss stuff because of Christmas vacation or whatever, So usually a good year is about, maybe they have a lesson 40 weeks out of that 52-week year. Maybe a little bit more, maybe 45%. But when you think about 40 weeks, that's one work week. You have one work week, normal work week, to teach them everything they need to know.
I never thought of it that way. Wow, that's true. Yikes.
It's scary. Yeah, it's scary. And it's like, oh my gosh. So if you had one designated week for that student, what exactly would you teach them? And how would you not waste those 40 hours? It puts things in a very different perspective. I can't waste this time. I'm not going to fritter this time away. What do they need to know? Okay, they need to know how to sight read. Oh boy, I better put in some sight reading. Okay, so we're going to do sight readings 10 minutes a day. They have to learn Bach, and they need to understand what, basic harmonies are. So we need to do that. We need to, whatever those things, they need a piece in each, out of each compositional period. By the time, we get finished with this particular year, that we need to have had, one piece per area. So it's like, whatever those priorities, and it's up to you, it's like, the private teachers get to do what they want. There's nobody hanging over their head saying you have to do this and this and this. But if you can see that's what you've got to work with, and then how, of course, are they going to make, of course, fortunately, we don't have to teach them all in 1 week. And fortunately, they go home and practice, right? They practice, right? And it's like, well, do they practice? So, and then if they do sit down to practice, how well do they practice? And so that's an important thing, because if they're not, if they practice, even if you have an hour lesson, and they practice, let's say 30 minutes a day for the days they don't see you, that's still 3 hours that they could utilize really well. That's 3 times more of the time than when you saw them. So can they use those 3 hours well? And if they can, but most students can't. I mean, most, especially young students, they haven't a clue as to how to practice. They just start at the beginning and stop at the end and sort of fix things along the way and put it away because they're out of time. So that's another thing we have to teach them during the lesson. We can't just say, go home and practice.
Yeah. How do you, because there is something that everybody struggles with, right? I mean, like and just like, okay, go work on this, student. Okay, well, how? What do I do? How are they going to work? Do you have any, I'm sure you have tons, but maybe can you offer a couple strategies maybe for that, especially that like younger student age, the elementary school, middle school maybe?
Well, I mean, one of the big things about practicing is to get them to observe themselves. Because if they can't notice that something's wrong, then they don't even know to go back and practice it, right? So let's say I'll let them play through their whole piece, and then I'll ask them. I mean, I usually have a big list of things I want to get to, but I'll ask them what did they notice. What did they like, and what didn't they like? Usually, if they find something they like, I really like my tone, or I use my whole bow on this, note or whatever. Anything, even if it's the most basic thing, I'll get them to show that to me again. So it helps, number one, reinforce what they did well, because it's so easy to just gravitate towards all the bad stuff. And it's like, but if they did something well, you want them to say, you want to say, that was really good. How did you do that? And then have to do it again and reinforce that. And then the other thing is something didn't go well. Well, I stumbled on these notes, or I couldn't keep going, or whatever. Okay, so let's go back to that. And then I usually do say, so practice that. Just take 1 minute and practice that. And then you learn a lot by just watching your student practice. Don't weigh in. Don't just let them work on it. A lot of times they'll play through it twice. They'll do it once badly, once pretty well, and they'll stop and look at you. Mm-hmm. Well, really, I mean.
Yeah, right.
You did it right now, so it's okay. I said, well, you did once right and once wrong, so that gives you about a 50-50 chance of getting it right again. Maybe we need to get up our odds a little bit. And so then that starts us on the road to getting them to start thinking, okay, well, if I did it once wrong, can I do it 3 to 5 more times correctly? one of my colleagues says, however old they are, that's how many times they need to do a repetition correctly. And that's fair enough. So anyway, you kind of set this sort of standard for how they're going to do it. And I usually talk to them about brain stuff just because I think it's so cool anyway, that you're trying to develop a connection that's really clear and it's going to make that your brain's going to say, oh, that's what that person, this is what I want to do, rather than having one, 2 or 3 different ways and they're all mixed up. Some of them are bad, some are good. And it's like, okay, which one do we choose from? We're trying to make a connection in the brain that says this makes it correct. And until we've done that, it has nothing to do with whether we're smart, dumb, anything. It just has to do with making a new connection up here. And the more we do it correctly, the more reinforced that connection becomes until it's an automatically correct thing. So that's essential. And then I do give them a whole bunch of ways. I love backwards and forwards and, add a note. So they're not doing something well and they're trying to take on a whole big passage of 16th notes. They're not just struggling through it. I say, can you play first note fast? Can you play first and the second note fast together? Can you add a third note to that? Could you do, just anything to get them to go, oh yeah, I can do this and then I can do this and then expand out from there and then try a new section and then chunk those sections together. So we do this in the lessons. You go, oh, I can do this. I guess I have to say that that's another thing for a lesson is what really engages students in lessons. One of them is getting them to do something really good and they know it. Whatever it is, something that they do extremely well, even if it means coming around. Sometimes I'm trying to get students to make a beautiful sound with their vibrato. And some, that's a little skinny. So I just come around the other side of the cello and I put my hand on their vibrating hand. I say, okay, your job is to pull the string and I'm going to help you with the vibrato. And suddenly they're making this great sound and their eyes just like get big, and it's exciting, and that's what engages them. That's what makes them want to go home and practice. It's the fun stuff, not, oh, this isn't very good. Those things are really important. And another thing is, frankly, just in the details. I see in younger students not being willing to go into detail with a student. It's like, that's too burdensome. It's like, oh, well, they probably wouldn't get it. They wouldn't do it very well anyway, or whatever. When I say a student to a student, play that note short, and they play ba, and I'll say, is that short? Yeah. I said, well, how could you play it shorter? Could you play it shorter still? And I get them to play the shortest note on the planet, right? So that they are working so hard on this detail to get the notes super short. This is just one example, or are you using all your bow? Well, yes. And it's like, well, they're using this much bow instead of this much bow. And so getting them to actually observe something and notice the details of what they're doing, and of course, what details can they manage? Well, beginners and young kids, they still can do, how short can you play? You can play games about, whose note was louder or whose note was shorter or whose note was longer, or is this note longer than this note, and comparing. There's just ways to engage students in real specifics because it brings them into focus. They forget about the fact that they're having a lesson, frankly, because they get so engaged. So those things are just huge when it comes to really engaging students. And of course, that whole planning thing, if you know details about the music because you've seen them yourself and they're there, you can start showing your students those things. And they're, like I say, it doesn't have to be super sophisticated. I did a lesson plan on Twinkle pretty much on a dare. And I think, yes, you can.
Well, I'd love to. Well, this is great. Because that's such a hard thing for people to do, is to engage the student in the lesson. I love that point. To give them a win. Have a moment during the lessons, guys, rather than you're just sitting there. Nope, that's wrong. That's wrong. I'd love to hear a little bit about Rosin Dust. And I'll make sure to link up to that. And I read it and it's great. And it digs into what we're talking about. Can you maybe just briefly talk about when you came up with the idea for the book and a little bit about the book?
Oh, sure. Well, ever since I'd studied with David Wells, and I don't know how many people would know David Wells, but he taught at Hart School of Music and took me on as a sophomore. He was such a brilliant teacher. He did so much for me personally as well as musically. But really, when it came right down to it, what was happening was I'd always liked writing anyway. And he'd say things like, oh, that worked, like we'll have a lesson. And he'd show me something and I'd try it and he goes, oh, that worked well. I should add that to my book. And so I started asking him as I got to know him better. I say, when are you going to write your book? And I kept, the more I got to know him, the more I said, well, maybe I should write the book for you. And so we started, I actually moved to Vermont for a while where he was living, and we started meeting like once a week, and he'd sit and talk about his ideas about teaching and music and stuff. And he was in a lot of ways, very deep thinker, very philosophical and kind of esoteric. And it never quite did the right thing for him. So as much as I know he appreciated my efforts, it wasn't really working very well. So we kind of let it go. But then I'd had all these notes and all these things that I'd been thinking about. And I started, long story short, started writing a newsletter. One of my husband's friends had been sending a dance newsletter, and she'd always put in she'd say about things going on around town and everything. And then she'd always put some little short thing about, an exercise you could try or. So Max said, well, why don't you just write a little, newsletter like what she's doing and just send it out because you're so worried about what everybody thinks about as I was. And so I did. That's what I started doing. I just started writing these little newsletters, and the more I sent them out, the more feedback I got, and the more people wanting to join the mailing list and stuff. And it got to the point where I had a mailing list of these newsletters of about, 250 people I was sending them out to whenever I got them done. And they got longer and longer and longer as I got windier and windier. Anyway, so then I ended up having this bound thing of all my rosin dust newsletters, and it was so, people wanted that, but it was very hard to publish that way. So I finally said, okay, maybe it's time to turn this into a book. So that's basically what I did. And it really has to do, there's some things in there that are cello specific, but mostly it has to do with how do you get them to learn how to practice. But anyway, that, and I have a little chapter there on CMP and about teaching musicianship, which is can be a hard thing to teach, except I don't know, I guess I had a really good example in David because he was always such a profound guy. Always knew how to get right to the music. I'll add this one little story. He was teaching me, I thought it was one of my first lessons. It was probably, in my second semester with him. But he said it's time to work on a Beethoven sonata, so he wanted me to play a G minor sonata. So I got the music and I learned, worked through the first movement, but I was still very much in kind of a novice at the cello. I really was not very good. But I did my best, it starts on a G, like open string G, forte piano, quarter note or dotted quarter. Anyway, and so I very, then went loud, and played. And he stopped me right there and he said, he says, Corky, this isn't just, a G and it's loud and then soft. Imagine a darkened stage and everything's black in there. And he said, and the curtain very quietly goes up and suddenly the light comes. Ah! This is Beethoven, right in my face. This is Beethoven. It's passion and pathos, and he was talking about that, the power and the impact of this music and this personality behind the music. And then we got into talking about whether I was holding my voice properly and how to make a forte piano that sounded powerful. But he started with the music, and then he talked about Beethoven and who the man was and what this music was all about. And then we got to there's CMP right there, right? That's like, I never really thought about that until after, but that was a really powerful lesson in that it doesn't have to take a long time to communicate what is important about the music. Like some people say, oh, well, this takes too much time and then we won't have enough time to rehearse. It's like, it doesn't, it's like where are your priorities? It's like if you can front load what really matters in your lessons, it's huge. Instead of just, saying, okay, this is your new piece. Can't, write in the fingerings here, change your bow here. Oh, this is a tricky measure to count. It goes like this. You say, well, who's this person? What's this name doing over here? And who was this guy? And what is this piece? And what's the title of the piece mean? And what key are we in? And get them engaged in this whole thing. What do we do as musicians when we get a piece of music put in front of us? We don't just go, oh, I wonder what finger I'm going to use on my first note. That does not occur to us. We always look at the composer first, right? But do we do that with our students? So, and we're trying to train them to not necessarily be professional musicians, but be musicians at heart and really connect with music. But we need to show them how we do it and engage them in that process so that they start doing it.
That's a great example. I love that. And just putting the music first and then letting those details follow. Yeah. Corky, this has been fantastic. I'm so appreciative of you taking the time, and I can't wait to get this out to folks. Well, thanks, Corky, for chatting. It's so great to talk with you about teaching. And check out Rosin Dust and everything else that Corky's up to in the show notes for this episode. And thanks for tuning in to this week where we're focusing on teaching. I love doing thematic weeks like this. I've got so many ideas of other weeks to do like this coming up in the future. And check out contrabassconversations.com/teaching. This page is going to evolve over the days, weeks, months, years, but I really want it to be a good resource for all of you out there. Check it out. Pass it along to students if you want to give them some easy step-by-step recommendations. Pass them along to colleagues. Let me know if I should add anything to this. Send me an email, feedback@contrabassconversations.com. We're going to be digging into public school teaching, a very important topic and something that I'm super passionate about, tomorrow with Dennis Bergevin. So stay tuned for that, and we will see you again soon for more life in the low end of the spectrum.